Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome back once again to Veritate, and Merry Christmas still, as it is still Christmas here in the Catholic Church. And for us, Christmas is not a single day, it's a season. And so the church celebrates the Nativity for 12 days because the Incarnation cannot be contained in a moment. And those 12 days are not symbolic nostalgia either, they're deliberate instruction. So while the world tears down their decorations and they take down all of their lights and they're moving on, the church actually continues to kneel, to pray, and to fast. And so the octave and the 12 days of Christmas teach us that God entering into time changes everything, not briefly, but permanently. So Christmas does not end because attention fades. It endures because the truth does not expire. This Christmas, I attended a very beautiful Latin Mass at St. Edward's the Confessor in Phoenix. And I want to be really precise here about what struck me. And this is not about preference. It's not about aesthetics or even nostalgia. What impressed me the most was the order. Before a single word was ever spoken, before the priest even reached the altar, the room itself taught me a lesson. It taught me about sacred silence. And I'm not talking about the kind of silence that feels awkward or unfinished. I'm not the kind that exists because nothing is happening. This was ordered silence. It was purposeful silence. And it's the kind of silence that tells you that something real is already taking place. And no one rushed to fill it. I saw men kneel without hesitation. Not slowly, not reluctantly. They knelt because kneeling made sense. It's as if their bodies already knew what their mouths didn't need to say. And I saw children follow them. And that matters. Because no one had to explain reverence. No one had to negotiate behavior. And the posture of the fathers actually taught the children everything they needed to know. That's called formation. And there was no casual movements. There was no wandering eyes. There was no sense that this was optional or even adjustable. The environment itself imposed discipline, and not by force, but by clarity. And then those priests approached that altar. And they didn't act like they were a host welcoming guests. No, the priest didn't speak as a personality. He didn't even face the people as an audience. He faced God. And that orientation matters more than most people realize, because when the priest faces the altar, he's actually making a statement without words. And that statement is, this is not about me. This is not about you. This is about God. Every movement was deliberate. There was no theatrics involved. It was all deliberate. And precision matters when reality is present. And carelessness disappears when something serious is at stake. There was nothing improvisational about it. There was nothing casual about it. There was nothing that suggested that comfort or convenience were guiding principles there. And that's when the thought became unavoidable. This Mass was not designed to make me feel welcome. It was designed to remind me where I stand. And today, modern culture equates welcome with comfort. But the church never has. The church has always equated welcome with truth. You are welcome here, but you are not in charge here. And that distinction actually changes everything. And so as the prayers continued, there was another difference that became very clear. Time slowed down. Not artificially. It slowed down naturally. And that's what happens, right? When eternity is acknowledged, that urgency disappears. There was no rush when you understand where you are. And even the silence between the words was not dead space. It was instructional as well. It taught patience. It taught restraint. It taught that not every moment needs to be filled. And that's when the most important realization settled in. That is what Christmas looks like when Christ is taken seriously. Not sentimental, not performative, not self-focused, ordered. And at that altar, Christmas was not about my feelings. It wasn't about my memories, not even my preferences. It was about God acting and man responding. That Mass did not ask me what I wanted Christmas to be. It actually told me what Christmas is. And now once you see that clearly, you begin to understand why modern Christmas feels so hollow. And that's because most people are celebrating something that's entirely different. Dear family, what Christmas has become is that once you leave this kind of ordered worship, then the contrast becomes unavoidable. Because what most people today call Christmas, it looks nothing like what I just described. The modern Christmas begins early and it never seems like it slows down. I've seen Christmas songs and Christmas sales going up even at the beginning of November, sometimes all the way into October. The world does not prepare, it consumes. You see decorations appearing before Advent even starts. You got music playing before there's been any silence. And then the schedules get filled up with parties and obligations and then events that they crowd out reflection because nothing waits. Waiting feels like it's a problem now, and silence feels uncomfortable. It's as if stillness feels unproductive. And that alone should tell you that something's gone wrong. Christmas used to train patience, but now it trains appetite. And I want you to look at the order carefully. The season begins with noise, not with prayer, right? Everybody's waiting on Mariah Carey to start freaking singing. It accelerates instead of preparing. It rewards excess instead of restraint. And Christ is present, sure, but only in peripheral. You could have a nativity scene appearing somewhere like outside of someone's home or placed off to the side, or there starts to be these little decorations that appear. And of course, his name is spoken carefully, but it's usually detached from any obligation. The Mass, if attended at all, is fitted in around everything else. Sometimes I've gone to Masses and it's rushed. Sometimes I've seen people skip it, and it gets treated as though it's optional. But you see, that order matters, because whatever you place at the center of your life, it teaches everyone watching what matters the most to you. And in most homes now, Christmas does not revolve around worship. It's worship that revolves around convenience. And convenience will always dethrone God. Now, that didn't happen overnight either. It happened slowly, through a series of small concessions that felt harmless at the time. Those concessions are, we're busy, we're tired, the kids won't understand, we can go later. And those reasons, they sound reasonable, but reasonable reasons repeated year after year become formation. And then children learn without being told, and they learn what can be delayed, they learn what can be skipped, they learn what's negotiable. And when worship becomes flexible, then God becomes optional. And modern Christmas confuses generosity with abundance. It's as if you got to get more gifts, bigger gifts, earlier gifts. But abundance without meaning does not produce gratitude. It produces expectation. Because our children learn to measure love by quantity. You probably have kids that go and count how many toys they've got. I've heard of this. And then adults learn to measure success by how much spending they've done. And disappointment follows almost immediately because no amount of excess will satisfy a disordered appetite. And that's not a character flaw. That's a predictable outcome. And Christmas becomes exhausting because it carries a weight that it was never meant to carry. It's expected to provide joy. It's expected to provide peace. It's even expected to provide meaning. But those things don't come from consumption. They come from order. And when order is missing, everything becomes fragile. And that's why people feel stressed every December, and they cannot explain why. It's because they feel pressure. They feel resentment. They feel fatigue. and disappointment even when everything looks successful from the outside. And they think that the problem is they got too much to do. And it's not. The problem is that Christmas is being asked to deliver what only worship can provide. And another change that is subtle but damaging is Christmas has become centered on experience rather than truth. How does it feel? Did you enjoy it? Was it magical? And you see, these questions are not neutral because they teach that the purpose of the season is emotional satisfaction. But Christianity has never measured truth by feeling. It measures truth by obedience. And so if feeling becomes the standard, then disappointment is inevitable. And why? Because feelings change and circumstances interfere and expectations go unmet. Truth does not bend like that. And once you reduce Christmas to an experience, then Christ will become optional. And why? Because Christ demands obedience, not just enjoyment. And that is why the modern Christmas feels hollow even when it's full. It's full of noise, it's full of activity, it's full of gifts, but it's empty of peace. And I don't want to say that's because people are evil, but it is because order has been reversed. When the celebration comes before the worship, the celebration cannot sustain itself. It collapses under the weight of expectation. And that brings us to the phrase that everyone repeats without even thinking about it. Keep Christ in Christmas. That phrase emerges precisely because something essential is already missing from the equation. It's an incomplete lie that gets repeated by politicians, retailers, social media posts, and even well-meaning Christians will say this. And it feels like it's some form of a defense of the faith. It feels like a resistance in this modern world, but it stops short of the truth. And dear family, anytime that something stops short of the truth, eventually it serves the lie. And you need to understand why this phrase survives so easily in modern culture today. It survives because it demands nothing. You can say, keep Christ in Christmas and never kneel. You can say it and never attend Mass. You can say it and never change how you live. It allows Christ to remain as an idea, but he's not Lord. And that distinction will matter because Christianity does not collapse when Christ is denied outright. It collapses when he is reduced. When Christ gets reduced to a sentiment, when he gets reduced to a symbol, when he gets reduced to decoration, when he gets reduced to lights, if he's a Christ that never interferes with your schedule, if he never disrupts your plans, and he never challenges your priorities, well, that version of Christ is really easy to keep. And that's why that phrase is tolerated everywhere, because it asks for acknowledgement. That's it, not obedience. You have Christ appearing on cards. You have Christ appearing in songs. You have Christ appearing in conversations. But the moment that worship enters into the discussion, the discomfort follows. Now all of a sudden, Mass becomes inconvenient, and obligation becomes offensive, and submission becomes unacceptable. So the phrase, keep Christ in Christmas, creates this illusion of fidelity while allowing people to avoid the very thing that makes Christianity real. That's not accidental either. That's strategic. Even if it's unconsciously. Look, modern culture prefers spirituality without authority. A Christ who inspires values is welcome, but a Christ who commands worship is not. And that is why that phrase sounds faithful while it produces no change. It keeps Christ present in name, but it keeps him absent in practice. And here's a hard truth for you. You cannot keep Christ without keeping what he established. You can't separate Christ from worship and then still claim fidelity. You can't separate Christ from obedience and call it faith. A Christ who asks nothing is not the Christ who was born. So when people are repeating that phrase, they usually mean something sincere. They mean, don't forget about Jesus. They mean, remember the reason for the season. But remembrance without response is not faith. That is nostalgia. Because faith responds. And that's the reason that phrase fails. Because it doesn't answer the question that actually matters. What does keeping Christ require of you? Because if Christ is truly present, something must change. Your time must change. Your priorities must change. Your order must change. And if nothing changes, Christ has not been kept. He's been contained. And a contained Christ is saved. A contained Christ is manageable. And a contained Christ will never confront sin. And that is why that phrase never mentions worship. Because worship costs something. It's going to cost you your time. It's going to cost you your pride. It's going to cost you your sense of control. So that phrase stops before it reaches the altar. It keeps Christ in the story, but not in the structure. And that brings us to the word everyone uses without thinking about it. Christmas. That word is not a vague acknowledgement. It doesn't mean sentiment. It doesn't mean seasonal spirituality. It actually means something very specific. And once you understand that, the incompleteness of the phrase becomes impossible to ignore. Because the word is the Christ Mass. So what was removed? The word that everyone uses already tells you what's missing. Christ Mass. That's not sentimental, and that's not feeling, and that is not vague. That is very precise. Christ Mass. That's not decoration. That's definition. Christmas exists because the Mass exists. The feast flows from worship. The joy flows from the sacrifice. If you remove the Mass and you do not simplify Christmas, you dismantle it. And that's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Because once you say Mass out loud, now obligation enters the room. Time enters the room. Submission enters the room. Reality enters the room. You see, a Christ without the Mass is easy to keep. A Christ with the Mass demands something from you. And modern culture does not like demands. The Mass is not some accessory that the church added later. It's not a tradition that got layered on top of Christmas. It's the reason Christmas exists at all. And that's because at the Mass, the Incarnation is proclaimed. The sacrifice is made present. At Mass, heaven meets earth. Christmas celebrates God entering into the world, and the Mass is where that entry is encountered. You can't celebrate the event while rejecting the encounter. That's exactly what has happened. The Mass was quietly removed, not with hostility and not with excuses. We're busy. We'll go later. God understands. The kids are tired. You see, those excuses sound harmless, and they get repeated year after year after year, and then they form belief. Remember what the church always said, lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi. And so what's being taught is that worship is optional. And it teaches that God waits on us, and that obedience is somehow negotiable. But once the Mass becomes optional, Christ becomes optional with it. And that's the reason why the phrase of keep Christ in Christmas feels sufficient to so many people. It allows Christ to remain as an idea while the Mass disappears in practice. Because a Christ without the Mass, he becomes inspirational. He teaches kindness. He encourages generosity. He affirms values, but he never confronts sin. And he never demands repentance, and he never requires submission. You see, that Christ is welcome everywhere. But that is not the Christ who was born. The Christ who entered the world did not come to inspire some vague goodness. He came to establish worship. He came to offer himself. And so the Mass is where that offering is encountered. Without the Mass, Christmas becomes a story that you retell instead of a reality that you enter into. That's why modern Christmas feels disconnected. People celebrate a birth while avoiding the sacrifice that the birth leads to. The manger leads to the altar, and the altar leads to the cross, and the cross leads to salvation. You can't remove the altar and keep the result. That's just an uncomfortable truth. But if you skip Mass on Christmas and you keep the decorations and you keep the music, you keep the gifts, you keep the atmosphere, you have not kept Christ. You kept the shell. And the Mass is not one tradition among many. It is the organizing principle of the Christ Mass. If you remove it, everything else loses its anchor. And that's now why Christmas floats. It feels weightless. And that's why it collapses into stress and excess. And once you understand that Christmas means Christ Mass, the modern celebration becomes impossible to defend, because it celebrates Christ while avoiding the very place he gives himself. And that will force a decision. So either the Mass is central or Christmas is incomplete. There's no third option there. And so what Christmas traditionally ordered, before Christmas became an event, it was a feast. And before it was a feast, it was worship. Traditionally, Christmas did not begin at home. It began at the altar. That's just fact. The entire day was ordered around the Christ Mass. Families didn't ask where Mass would fit into this. They asked what would fit after Mass. So the altar set the schedule. Everything else followed from that. And that order didn't have to be explained. It taught itself. Advent prepared the soul before Christmas touched the body. And that preparation mattered because silence was intentional. Waiting was normal. Fasting was understood. You learn restraint before abundance. You learn patience before joy. You learn to receive by first learning to wait. And that formation shaped how people experienced Christmas itself. So when the feast finally did arrive, it wasn't frantic. It wasn't bloated. It wasn't desperate to manufacture joy. Joy was already there because obedience came first. The church never taught that celebration was wrong. She taught that celebration must follow worship. And when that order is respected, the celebration becomes stable. And when it gets ignored, the celebration collapses. So traditionally, families move from the altar to the table in a straight line. The altar taught reverence. The table expressed the gratitude. The table was not a replacement for the worship. It was an extension of it. Even gifts followed that same line of logic. Yes, there were fewer gifts, but these gifts were deliberate. They were explained. A gift wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to point beyond itself. It reminded the recipient that God gives first, always. Children were not overwhelmed with abundance. They were trained in gratitude. They learned to say thank you because they knew they were receiving something, not claiming something. That distinction matters because Christmas also reinforced hierarchy, not as some form of domination, but as order. Fathers led prayer. Mothers cultivated the home. Children learned by watching. Faith was not outsourced. It was practiced. You didn't have to explain theology to a child to teach reverence. The structure of the day taught it. God first, everything else second. And that order formed souls quietly and consistently. There was never a debate about whether Mass was necessary. That question never came up. The Christ Mass was assumed because Christmas itself made no sense without it. And that's the point most people miss. That order produced peace. It didn't produce excitement. It didn't produce spectacle. Peace. And that's because peace follows order every time. When worship comes first, everything else will find its place. But when worship gets removed, everything else will compete for the center. And that's why modern Christmas feels chaotic, because it has no anchor. Traditional Christmas felt grounded because it did. It was not perfect. No family ever is, but it was ordered. And order will always outperform intention. People today, they say often they want a simpler Christmas, but what they really want is an ordered one. Simplicity is a result, not a strategy. Order produces simplicity, and disorder produces excess. And that's why restoring Christmas don't begin with buying less or scheduling better. It begins by restoring the altar to the center. And once that order is restored, everything else becomes easier to decide. What you want to keep, what you want to remove, what you reduce. And without that order, every decision becomes emotional and it's exhausting. But with it, decisions become obvious. And that leads directly to the cost of removing the Mass which is what I hope to address, that when the Mass is removed, something does not disappear. Something replaces it. And what replaces that worship is always going to be the self. That's not theory, that is observable. Because once the altar is no longer the center, every other part of Christmas begins to compete for control. Schedules will compete, traditions will compete, preferences compete, emotions compete, and that competition produces tension. And that's why modern Christmas feels stressful even when everything looks successful from the outside. So many people will say they're overwhelmed, but they can't say why. They have time off, they got food, they got gifts, they got music, but still something feels wrong. And that feeling is not psychological, it's actually spiritual. And that's because when worship is removed, Christmas is forced to carry a burden it was never meant to carry. It's expected to create joy, it's expected to create peace, it's expected to create meaning, but joy, peace, and meaning are not produced by activity, they're produced by order. And that order will always begin at the altar. Without the Mass, children are going to be trained incorrectly because they'll learn to expect instead of receive. They learn that abundance is normal. They learn that disappointment is someone else's fault. That's not because parents are careless. It's because formation happens whether you intend it or not. If worship is optional, entitlement becomes normal. And adults are affected just as deeply. Adults will overspend and they'll call it generosity. They overcommit and they'll call it tradition. They overindulge and they call it celebration. And then they wonder why resentment creeps in. Because they feel pressure to perform. They feel pressure to deliver magic. They feel pressure to meet expectations that never stabilize. That pressure does not come from Christ. It comes from self-worship. When Christ is not at the center, the self becomes fragile. And fragile things demand constant protection. That's why people become defensive about Christmas. Don't judge, don't criticize, don't challenge how we celebrate. Those reactions reveal insecurity, not confidence. Worship produces stability. Self-focus produces anxiety. Another cost is subtle but serious. Authority in the home weakens. When parents negotiate worship, children learn that authority is flexible. When Mass is skipped for convenience, children learn that obedience is conditional. They may not be able to articulate that, but they absorb it. And later, that same logic will get applied everywhere. Rules become negotiable, commitment becomes optional, discipline becomes offensive. And parents are left confused about where the authority went. It didn't vanish, it was surrendered. And that is predictable. Because when the Mass disappears, Christmas loses its anchor. Without an anchor, it drifts, and drift always feels like freedom at first, until it does not. People chase a better Christmas every year. They want it more meaningful, more intentional, more magical, but nothing ever satisfies. And that's because they're trying to fix disorder with effort instead of order. And that's where the hardest truth of all must be said. A Christmas without the Mass trains people to worship themselves while claiming they are honoring Jesus Christ. And that is not a neutral mistake. That's a formation problem. Christ does not coexist with self-rule. One replaces the other. A man does not serve two masters. So when the Mass is removed, Christmas does not become neutral. It becomes anthropocentric. Man moves to the center. God moves to the margin. Everything else begins to wobble. That's the cost people feel, but they cannot name. That's that feeling that you have. And until that cost gets acknowledged, nothing changes. Remember this, if nothing changes, nothing changes. That brings us to the only place that restoration can actually happen. In the home. You have to restore order in the home first. You don't fix Christmas by fixing culture. You fix Christmas by fixing your house. Now, I have to say that because many people hide behind frustration with the world to avoid responsibility at home. But culture follows households, not the other way around. Restoring Christmas does not begin with slogans or complaints or even online arguments. It begins with order, and order is established by decision, not discussion. The first decision is really simple. Mass is not negotiable. It's not squeezed in. It's not rushed through. It's not treated as an accessory. Christmas begins at the altar, or it does not begin at all. So when parents treat Mass as though it's immovable, children learn something without a lecture. They learn that God does not compete for time. Everything else competes with Him. That single decision will reorder the entire day. Now, the second correction is just as important as the first. Worship comes before celebration, not later. Not after the gifts get opened, not once everybody's settled in, first. That's not symbolic, it's formative. Children do not learn priorities from speeches, they learn from sequence. And what comes first matters. When worship comes first, everything else relaxes, and the pressure to perform disappears. The need to manufacture joy will fade. Joy follows obedience naturally. Now, the third correction is intentional reduction. This part will require discipline. Fewer gifts, clearer meaning, explicit gratitude. Excess trains entitlement. Reduction trains gratitude. Every gift you get should be explainable. Not just what it is, but why it is given. Children need to hear that these gifts are not owed, they are received. Gratitude must be spoken, not assumed. When children have to say thank you out loud, they're being trained to recognize that they are not the source of what they receive. And that training matters. And the fourth correction is verbal clarity. Say the order out loud. Don't hint, don't imply, don't soften. We go to Mass first because God comes first. Children will respect clarity. They struggle with ambiguity. And when parents apologize for discipline, children learn that authority is insecure. So when parents speak plainly, children relax. Order produces peace. Now, the fifth correction is refusing to apologize for structure. Today, modern parents are trained to explain themselves endlessly, and that habit actually weakens authority. Structure does not need justification, it produces results. You do not apologize for feeding your children properly. You do not apologize for bedtime. You do not apologize for discipline. Worship belongs in that same category. It's not optional because it's essential. When the home is ordered that way, several things happen quickly. Number one, stress decreases, resentment fades, expectations stabilize, peace increases. Not because Christmas became smaller, but because it became real. Children sense when adults are in control. They feel safe when the order is clear. And they actually become anxious when everything feels negotiable. A home that's ordered around worship teaches children where security actually comes from. It doesn't come from abundance. It doesn't come from entertainment. It doesn't come from comfort. It comes from order. It's not about being strict. It's about being serious. And Christmas is serious because what it celebrates is serious. God entered the world. Time was pierced by eternity. Salvation became possible. That reality deserves more than just feeling. It deserves structure. And when that structure is restored in the home, Christmas begins to heal. Not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. And that brings us to our final examination. At this point, the question is no longer theoretical, it is practical. There are 2 Christmases offered every year, not in the abstract, in real decisions, real schedules, and real homes. One Christmas keeps Christ as an idea. One Christmas keeps the Christ Mass as reality. One allows worship to fit when it's convenient, and one orders everything else around worship. One flatters the self, one forms the soul. And you cannot choose both. And I have to say that because modern Christianity tries to live in the middle. It keeps language while avoiding obligation. It keeps symbols while avoiding submission. But the Incarnation does not allow neutrality. God entered into time. God took flesh. God demanded a response. That response is worship. That's where honesty matters. You have to ask yourself this directly. Did your Christmas begin at the altar, or did the altar compete for time? Did your children see worship as central, or was it optional? Did the celebration flow from obedience, or did it replace it? Did your home reflect order, or was it negotiation? Now look, these questions are not meant to shame. They're meant to clarify. Because clarity precedes correction. If the Mass was missing, the feast was incomplete. Not because God withholds joy, but because joy only settles where order exists. Here's the part that's got to be understood without defensiveness. Christ does not need your decorations. Christ does not need your slogans. Christ does not need seasonal acknowledgement. Christ demands worship. The Christ who was born did not come to decorate your life. He came to rule it. And that truth doesn't make Christmas smaller. It makes it real. A Christmas that is centered on Jesus Christ at the altar is not less joyful. It is more stable. It doesn't burn hot and then collapse. It endures. And that's why people raised in ordered homes remember Christmas as peaceful even when it was simple. Because peace follows order every time. This episode's not about reclaiming a tradition. It's about reclaiming authority. Authority in the home, authority in worship, authority over the self. Because when God is not first, something always else takes his place, and whatever takes his place eventually collapses under its own weight. That choice will be offered again next year and the year after that. Every year you're given stewardship over a home. One Christmas will tell you that you deserve comfort, indulgence, and control, and the other one will tell you to kneel. And only one of those is going to save your soul. So if the Mass is missing, the feast is incomplete. So choose order, choose worship, choose the real Christmas. In nomine Patri, et Filii, et Spiritui Sancti. Lord Jesus Christ, you didn't come to entertain us. You came to save us. You entered time in humility. You were born in silence. You were laid in a manger, not a throne. Teach us to recognize you where you choose to be found. Restore order in our homes. Restore reverence in our worship. Restore obedience in our hearts. Forgive us for the times we've made you optional. Forgive us the times we've placed comfort before worship. Forgive us for the times we've celebrated while neglecting the altar. Give us the courage to kneel. Give us the discipline to order our lives around you. Give us the humility to receive rather than demand. Bless our families. Form our children. Strengthen fathers to lead with clarity and conviction. May our Christmas begin where it must begin. At the altar. In worship. In truth. We ask this of you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.